The third speaker this afternoon is Dr. Brian Hughes, who is Director of the Irish Association of Professional Historians, and he lectures in history in Mary Immaculate College in Limerick. His primary interest in research lies in the impact of the Irish Revolution on individuals and communities, especially the use of intimidation by the IRA. Among his publications is the first biography of Michael Mallon, the 1916 leader. His paper today is entitled Victims, Women in Compensation Records from the Irish Revolution. Over to you, Brian.
Thanks very much for the introduction. Thanks to Maeve for the invitation to speak, to the Royal Irish Academy and to the Library for hosting the event. I've already learned so much. And I particularly appreciate the invitation to speak here, as I'm acutely aware that I'm not a historian of women, and I'm in the company of pioneering scholars who are, and whose work I admire greatly. Women, though, do feature regularly in the histories that I write, so I hope from that sort of basis I can offer some useful perspectives and maybe pose some useful questions. Though I expect I've already learned more than I'll impart, and I probably would have rewritten the whole paper if I could have right before I started, but I better stick to what I've prepared. Now, my own work is primarily focused on what historians now call the Irish Revolution, and debates about whether it's a revolution at all can wait, but also its immediate aftermath as well, I should say. So the period roughly between 1912 and 23, in the early years of the Irish Free State. And I've been particularly interested in the everyday intimidation and violence that accompanied the revolution, and the experiences of non-combatants, so those who weren't members of any defined political or military organisation. And essentially the ways in which the revolution impacted on those lives, the decisions it forced them to make, and the consequences of those decisions. And by its nature, this research encompasses men and women. It's also been shaped by the archives that I've used, particularly my interest in Southern Irish Loyalist experiences of the revolution, and also in the Royal Irish Constabulary. And just in the case of the former, I might point to a real gap in terms of understanding and study of Southern Unionist women and Loyalist women. Someone like Lady Margaret Dockrell, who had a remarkable career at local government level. Her husband, Maurice Dockrell, was elected as an MP, but she had a very long political career at local government level. And she was also actually an active suffragist, unlike Londonderry. She was a member of suffrage organisations. And Dublin Unionism, there's an interesting divergence there. There are some unionist women in Dublin, for example, who are very anti-suffrage, but others who weren't. And in the case of the Royal Irish Constabulary, I'm also interested in their families as well as the men themselves. But one of the sets of sources that I've consistently looked to do all of this are compensation records generated by various schemes funded by the British and Free State governments in the aftermath of the Irish Revolution, particularly those available in the National Archives of Ireland and in the National Archives at Kew. And the revolutionary period caused a wide range of personal harm and damage to property, and this in turn generated several large collections of claims for financial recompense. In the National Archives of Ireland, for example, there are thousands of compensation claims relating to damage to property endured both before and after the truce on the 11th of July 1921 that sort of officially ended the Irish War of Independence. Files created under early Free State damage to property legislation, which were designed to either re-evaluate claims that had been made and heard or awarded and not paid out, or to assess new claims. Now, these files don't always provide huge amounts of detail or personal testimony, and so they're often quite brief, depending on the collection, and they can be easily overlooked. But they nevertheless help us get a real sense of the patterns of violence and loss that the revolution brought. They can also tell us a lot about the experiences of women who don't feature in archives generated by or about revolutionaries themselves. When viewed collectively, the sorts of losses applicants claim for, and where and when and sometimes why they state their losses, allows us to assess the extent and nature of violence nationally at a county level and more locally than that. They also demonstrate how the War of Independence and Civil War were not always about the big set pieces or the atrocities or the explosions of violence. They were also about the diurnal, the mundane even. So the bicycle stolen from Hannah Murphy, Sarah Byrne, Eilidh Coffey and others around Tipperary in 1922, for example, the injury to Alicia Fawcett's bullock in County Cavan, or the burning of 4 beehives containing bee and honey owned by Henrietta Ferguson Kelly in Rush, County Dublin in June 1922. And on top of this, then after around the same time as the damage to property legislation, the Free State Government created a Compensation Personal Injuries Committee to assess applications for personal injuries, including the death of a loved one sustained during the revolutionary period, which would then advise the government on ex gratia compensation payments. In 2017, extracts from application files held by the Department of Justice were released, having previously, I think, assumed to be lost, but I can be corrected on that. They're still underused, I think, but Gemma Clark has examined these files in her study of gender-based violence during the Civil War in an article published in Irish Historical Studies. And again, they don't necessarily provide significant amounts of detail, and the testimony is sometimes sparse. But they are a useful base for compiling data samples and, again, discerning patterns of physical violence suffered by women and by their families. Clark used the files to argue that, notwithstanding the important issues of the underreporting of sexual and gendered violence and the obtuse and often evasive language used where violence was reported, and I quote, "the genocidal aims underlying conflict-related gender-based violence elsewhere in the world were absent in Ireland, and also that gender-based violence was not used in a systematic way to realise political or military objectives during the Irish Civil War." And these conclusions, I think, don't undermine the severity and the impact of sexual and gender-based violence where they occurred. And again, they'll only account for those cases that were reported. But there are perhaps a slightly different conclusion there maybe than there might be in some other work in this area, some very important work in this area where it's approached in a slightly different way methodologically. But I think there's scope here to think a little bit more about that question of scale and intent. And it's a tricky question, but I think looking at compensation records can contribute to that conversation in terms of fleshing out cases, but also in terms of broadening the base which we can work with. And if this is something people want to discuss with afterwards, I'd like to hear, again, other people in the room who've done an awful lot more work on this than I have. Separately, the personal injury files can be used in conjunction with dependents' pension files contained as part of the military service pensions collection in the Military Archives of Ireland, where wives, parents and siblings could be awarded pensions or more often, as was the case, gratuities for the loss of a husband, son or brother while on active service during the revolutionary period. So what you get in these personal injury committee claims are the loss of civilians, essentially. And if you take, for example, cases from County Limerick, a large number of the personal injury compensation claims submitted by women were claims for the death of male relatives, often husbands, but not always husbands. And these would provide detail on cases where the deaths would not have fallen under army pensions legislation. So in terms of the impact of violence on women, there's a broader base there. Ellen O'Dwyer, for example, claimed for compensation for the death of her husband, Richard, a publican in Limerick City. He was killed by shots fired by a military patrol on the 2nd of February 1920. At the inquest into his death, the family's solicitor noted that Mr. and Mrs. O'Dwyer were law-abiding people, and through his death they saw the reward people got in that country for being law-abiding. So very much non-combatants. Combined, these varied sets of compensation files can tell us much about the emotional impact of bereavement, but also about the longevity of the practical and financial impacts of the loss of a male relative to revolutionary violence in a society that was very heavily wedded to the model of the male breadwinner, and the ways in which women were forced to cope with such loss, their struggles to do so, and also their resilience in doing so. At Richard O'Dwyer's inquest, it was stated that the family would not claim compensation, for they would not burden innocent civilians, by this they meant the ratepayers essentially, for an action which was placed solely at the doors of the military. It was exactly 4 years later, in February 1924, that Ellen O'Dwyer did apply for compensation from the Irish Free State government. And this was perhaps a sign of a change of a heart. Maybe this was her decision where the previous decision wasn't hers. But it might also be a sign of a change of financial circumstances 4 years into her widowhood. 4 years after Bridget Brennan's husband was killed in September 1922, my only means of support, as she described him, she wrote about how she was working as a seamstress in the village of Galbraith, County Limerick, to support her 5-year-old daughter and earning, as she put it, an average of about 10 shillings per week. But payment is at times very slack, owing to depression in the county, or in the country, I should say. Thomas Brennan was a gardener on the Massey estate in Ballyverney in Limerick. He'd been taken from his home and his body was later found with a label attached stating convicted spy. And these compensation claims required people to put a financial figure on the loss of a loved one. And that process itself is very interesting and it really speaks very little. The file speaks very little to the trauma of losing a husband in the fashion that she did. In late 2022, it was announced that the Compensational Personal Injury Committee files from the Department of Finance held in the National Archives would be released in April 2023. And again, these files can add to the available data sets and give us the details of individual experiences that have been overlooked previously. So for instance, and this is just drawing from the catalogue entry, so again, there's probably more details in the file itself, but John Galvin claimed compensation under the scheme on behalf of his daughter Christina, who was playing near the family home in Boherboy in Limerick on the 15th of September 1922 when she was wounded in the face and head by the explosion of a bomb thrown from a military car by a quote-unquote unknown person. And I don't think that's a case that's recorded anywhere else. The Irish Grants Committee, again another very comprehensive set of compensation records, was a British Treasury funded scheme of compensation for self-declared Southern Irish loyalists who suffered financial loss on account of their allegiance to the British government between the truce in July 1921 and the end of the Civil War in May 1923. And again, if we just take Limerick for an example, there are 151 applications from Limerick or with a connection to Limerick, and they highlight a wide range of interpersonal violence, threats, damage to property, intimidation suffered by the loyalist minority in the 26 counties that became the Irish Free State. Because they were compiled in the mid-1920s, and one of the questions asked people to state their current circumstances, they also give quite a bit of detail on how people lived in the years after 1922 and 1923. And again, that's an aspect of those forms that maybe hasn't been fully explored. But it's a particularly valuable source for violence against women, particularly what we might call petty violence and harassment and maybe non-physical violence as well, threats, intimidation, damage to property and other aspects that again maybe don't always get a huge amount of attention. There are more serious cases there as well. One of the applicants was Eileen Biggs, who was the victim of a vicious gang rape in Tipperary in 1922, and she's been the subject of recent work by Linda Connolly and others. But again, there's lots of that very low-level violence, if we want to use that term as well. Several of the Limerick applicants were ex-RAC or the wives of ex-RAC who were forced to leave Ireland either temporarily or permanently after they were disbanded from the force in 1922. And in these files we get vivid details of the impact of the war against the RAC and the disbandment of the RAC on police wives who had originally been forced by the rules of the RAC to move away from their home, move away from their family area on choosing to marry a member of the force. And where men left first, which was often the case, it was women who were left behind to care for children, to pack up or sell up property and to settle up affairs as best they could before following husbands over to wherever it was they'd gone. And again, there's lots of interesting questions that are raised around that process as well. But class is evident here as well, and many of the female Irish Grants Committee applicants from Limerick were from the upper classes, what we might call the upper classes. The women with the time and space perhaps to make such applications, and these applications were usually processed by a solicitor. Solicitors did very well at the Irish Grants Committee because a lot of the same names come up over and over again. But their standards of living and their expectations are accordingly different from other applicants. In December 1926, for example, Phoebe Cleave, who was widow of one of the founders of Cleave's Condensed Milk Company of Ireland, described how the only assets she had remaining were bringing in an income of under £300 per annum, and for the previous 18 months she was also receiving an annual allowance of £200 from the company who is now running the business. And she pointed out that there's no obligation on their behalf to continue paying me this allowance. So it's probably about 30, maybe about €40,000 per year in modern terms. But from her point of view, that was precarious. But again, there'll be others living very different standards of living, claiming for much smaller amounts. And the awards granted out are often dictated by class in some respects as well. 6 members of the Cleave family applied to the Irish Grants Committee with almost identical applications. The 4 male applicants all received large awards, and the 2 female applicants had their claims rejected. Probably the assumption that the men getting the money was enough. Again, I'm not sure exactly why, but that also raises questions. And these are archives that are, of course, and all of the archives I'm talking about are influenced and shaped by gender norms and by the society in which they were created, and those norms can be reflected in their contents. But they were also a place where some women at least could put themselves forward to make a case, to complain, to put perceived wrongs right, or to seek redress. The misogyny can be perhaps less overt than it sometimes is in the military service pensions collection, although then that can be debated. But women applying under these compensation schemes that I've discussed faced a lot of the same sorts of challenges, including the practical challenges of filling in forms, dealing with bureaucracy, travelling to have a case heard. So women applying for these compensation schemes and women applying for military service pensions or dependents pensions, a lot of the same kinds of challenges would be visible. And while by their very nature the women who appear in compensation records are victims of revolutionary violence in one way or another, we might avoid simply viewing them in that light. And these are also files that might demonstrate women's agency in the period, a confidence and a willingness to put themselves forward, even if they're doing so as victims, and interrogating what schemes women chose to apply to and who chose can potentially be illuminating. Why did Bridget Brennan seemingly fail to apply to the Irish Free State's Personal Injury Committee, but instead applied later as a loyalist to the Irish Grants Committee? Other women applied to more than one scheme, to the Free State government or to the British government as they saw fit. The fact that another Limerick applicant, Mrs. Roger Bean, as she's named on the claim form, who was the owner of, as she put it, 10 cows on a mountainy farm, submitted a rather scattered and incoherent application to a scheme specifically for Southern loyalists, perhaps suggests a certain desperation, but also points to a willingness to seek money wherever it might be got, to point out her grievances and her needs and describe her experiences anywhere they might be heard. Bean claimed £2,000 for losses incurred owing to the fright I got during the Black and Tans in Ireland, which is not really the point of the scheme. But and again, it's kind of quite difficult to figure out what exactly she was claiming for. But in a way, that in its own way is telling. And I should point as well, looking at the handwriting in these claim forms can be illuminating. The spelling mistakes, the grammar mistakes. In the recent collection edited by Anne Dolan and Katrina Crowe, they very deliberately left the writing as it was, left the spelling mistakes, the grammatical mistakes as they were, because that in its own way can tell you something about class, about education, about the position the person writing or filling in the form was in at the time. But Bean claimed that the actual loss that she had suffered was attributable to the raids in my home. Money would not pay for my health since, as I've lost a lot of money to doctors and operations and travelling. Now, when asked to demonstrate how her financial losses were the result of her allegiance to the British government in Ireland, she simply said that I claim I wanted peace in Ireland. And her claim was unsurprisingly rejected as out of scope. More generally, cases, including this one, where a woman seeks redress and her husband does not, in some cases these are widows, but in many cases they're not, may also be revealing. And there's a potentially wider cohort of women represented in compensation claims or applications, and they have collectively the potential to give us a broader and fuller sense of the experiences of women during the revolution and afterwards. And as I say, we can learn all sorts of things about class and about education and work and living standards as well. And at the same time, I should say, in terms of the context, the discussion earlier about access, a lot of what I'm suggesting here, which involves potentially examining and analysing thousands of files collectively, is not actually particularly easy to do at the minute. And there are questions around accessibility to files that are open, I think, as well, that we can discuss. And I'm very happy to be corrected on any of this. But I think there is, in some cases, it has become more challenging to access large collections of material that haven't been digitised. So, for example, 1916 compensation claims have been digitised by the National Archives. But the access arrangements in the National Archives in Dublin, for instance, around the compensation claims that I've talked about, are sometimes a little bit challenging. If you want to look at individual cases or small numbers of cases, it's very easy to do, but to look at a couple of thousand in a go or over a period of time is more challenging. So the files are held off-site, they have to be ordered 3 days in advance, there are order limits, you can order 6 of them at a time. So there's huge challenges there for anyone who's not based in Dublin or anyone who just doesn't have the time to spend, weeks at a time in an archive. And it's a long time since I've spent more than 2 days in a row in an archive, which depresses me greatly, but that's unfortunately the way it is. And I think this entirely is a resourcing issue. And again, the advice earlier about, contacting librarians and archives is very valuable. And I'm certainly happy to provide tea or coffee or cake or sweet treats to anyone who will help me out. But I think, these are questions worth discussing as well. And again, my experience with archivists has always been invariably wonderful, but some of those institutional restrictions can be a little bit problematic. And that might be where digitisation can be a challenge as well as an opportunity, as we've touched on already. And again, there are still other women's voices that remain more obscure. I might just also very briefly mention Mary Immaculate College, which is on the list on the sources for women's Irish history. The teach and practice reports there are a fabulous source. I mean, really, the things you could do with those teach and practice reports, it's women kind of evaluating other women's accents and dress and deportment and sort of all sorts of things. Really brilliant source. But Mary Immaculate College needs a proper special collections, it needs a proper archivist. I hope we're kind of moving in that direction, but it's not there yet. There's also the Oral History Archive, which is about 3,000 oral history interviews built up over many years by my colleague Dr. Maura Cronin, and hugely valuable source for social history, women's history, lots of students interviewing their grannies about kind of day-to-day life, which again, I don't think there's anything quite like it anywhere else, but it's not accessible at the minute. Again, we're trying to get it that way, we're trying to move that way, but it's not there yet. So again, that it's all about resources and money, isn't it, I guess, as was mentioned earlier. And then there are those other women's voices that will remain more obscure, the women who aren't confident enough or given the opportunity to make a case for compensation, and also the women who managed to get through it all and come out the other side without feeling they'd lost anything worth complaining about. So I wonder how we deal with them. So thank you very much.